So here we are. C.1 Species Communities Guiding Notes. So define a community, page 423. That's pretty obvious. How I'm going to structure this is I'm going to help you guys understand by highlighting where it is in the textbook. So I'm going to look in the textbook and define a community. And these are all IB style questions. So lower level questions like define, list, label are 1 point. And we will get into more in-depth explain, evaluate later in this presentation. And so these are the 1 point questions: define, list, label, just the basics that might be on an IB exam next year for you guys so that you can get those easy points. So if you look in our textbook, which is cool on here, I could just look through it. We're looking at something that is called a community, which I think most of us know. So a community is a population living together and interacting in one area. So there it is, community. And that community could be aquatic, it could be in various different ecosystems. So list limiting factors that affect the distribution of species. So we'll choose a different color for that. Limiting factors. Those are just any resources that are tough to get. So in the desert, we're talking about water. In other ecosystems, we're talking about other nutrients or resources such as space that are difficult to find. So limiting factors, if you look through your textbook, limiting factors, probably should erase that, are right here. Abiotic, biotic factors. So all of these factors listed actually can limit a system. So temperature could have an effect that is limiting to the organisms that live there. Water availability, salinity, which is salt, or various other things. Those are all the abiotic or non-living. In addition, we have biotic, so that's everything living. So how do relationships, prey, predator, and other competition for resources affect how species are distributed or where they are in the system? So that one's pretty straightforward. We have biotic and abiotic, and you need to go back and look in your textbook to list all of those. So the next thing is label and describe. That was right below. So we're looking at this graphic. So this diagram is showing species abundancy, or how many there are right there. And where there's the most, we call that optimum. And you're going to have to label the rest of your graph in that diagram. So if we go further down, the questions get harder. How are kangaroos a good example of how climate can be a limiting factor in the distribution of species? So if you would read the question with me, we're looking at 3 species of kangaroos. So we have species 1, species 2, species 3. Gigantus, Phylogenosus, and Rufus. And so we are looking at how climate, which is temperature and precipitation over time, not weather. Weather is just day. This is climate, so over the years, it takes years to understand climate. How does that affect, how's that a limiting factor in the distribution of species? So if you look at it, there is a tolerance level. So when you read your textbook, look for tolerance, and some species are more tolerant than others. So let's see our annual precipitation tolerance for some species is better than others. So if you look at tolerance, the lowest tolerance is gigantus for both temperature and precipitation. And our highest tolerance is rufus. So if you look at gigantus, that's the big one. It's the huge kangaroo, and rufus, the small. What this is saying is the big kangaroo, gigantus, is limited in its level of tolerance. So gigantus only exists in certain temperatures. They struggle most of the time though. And they only live with a certain amount of precipitation. So that limiting factor is actually stronger. And if you look at rufus, they're very successful at low precipitation, and they are very successful at high temperature. So we can expect these species, rufus, to survive in hot climates. And we can look at gigantus and expect them to be very specific in their temperature and precipitation. So you will read that in the chapter, but we are interpreting the graph to understand how climate or temperature and precipitation can be a limiting factor in its distribution, which is where the animals exist. As you can see, they have to be in a certain temperature and precipitation, which puts them in a certain area of Australia. That's the only place that kangaroos live. So describe a plant example of how limits and stress affect zone of tolerance. If you zoom out, the limit zone of tolerance example is Acinia frutescens, and that is the example you're going to read about. And it shows frutescens in different areas. So look at respiration rates and distribution, and that's similar to the other question that will be answered. So define a keystone. You guys can do that. What is one method to determine whether an organism is a keystone species? That is also in the text. So let's go to a little more data interpretation. So you're going to use this graphic to answer the following questions. So look at the food chain shown in the graph. Which organism would you hypothesis is the keystone species? Use the graphs to explain data support for your hypothesis. So let's read more about that before we dive in. This is a food chain of the kelp in the North Pacific. So if you think about it, let's look at the relationship between otters, sea urchins, and kelp. So let's make sure we know which one is which. Otters, sea urchins, and kelp. So this is much like the wolf example that we looked at in Yellowstone. Top predator is removed or increased, and that affects the species below it. So when it's looking at a keystone species, what is the key to this system? an imbalance with that keystone species would cause an imbalance with the rest of the system. So keystone species, you can determine populations of others. So if we look at the otter, what happens when the population decreases with the otter? So here we have a low sea urchin count. Otters eat sea urchins. So when otters are high, sea urchins are low. Okay? And this would be a normal range. So when otters are normal in range, sea urchins are low. Once otters decrease on are low in numbers, then sea urchins increase. The increase in sea urchins somehow leads to a decrease in kelp. So in my thinking, I am thinking that the otters are a keystone species, or the top predator is a keystone species. But we don't have data on this whale, do we? It doesn't say the whale, it says sea otter abundance decreases. So from this data, we can say that the highest predator is otter, and with a decrease in that, the whole system is affected. So in our example, the data supports that the otter is the one that affects the rest of the system throughout. So that is a keystone species. That is just based on the data. We would have to have further research to clarify that. So we are going to move forward. So far we've gotten through most of our chapter. This is questions you would answer as you read or after you read the chapter. So what role can species play in its community? These are all the different interactions, which include herbivory, predation, parasitism, and mutualism. So that's all on page 433. 433. So you're going to use those. Parasite, predators, mutualism, and herbivory. I didn't think they would put herbivory in there, but yeah, mutualism and herbivory. And I'm going to give these letters so we know what we're working with. This is P1, P2, M, and H. So when you go through problem 9, what interactions do following pairs represent? What you need to do is use these letter combinations. So P1, P2, M, and H. And those stand for those 4 examples of roles species play. And so there's lynx hair and all kinds of examples for different interactions. Describe competitive exclusion. Use data to support your claim. We are going to look at that in the next video. This is almost done with your notes or guiding questions. These questions would be on an IB style exam. So competitive exclusion is dealing with competition between species. You are going to look at these 2 species in your textbook and identify what would cause competitive exclusion. Good luck. Have a great weekend. I will see you as soon as I get back from Disneyland. Thanks. Have a good one. I'm so excited to do this for you guys. We are going to flip the classroom. So I'm taking my trip to Disneyland, but I will still be there to help you. This is going to be so cool. So we're in the unit discussing ecosystems, and we're in part 1, species and communities. So our overarching essential question is, how do limiting factors affect community structures? In other words, how do the resources available affect how the species in that community interact? So what I want to review with you guys is your guiding questions for C.1 from your textbook and from the notes. So let's look at question 1.